where we've been talking for the last few weeks about getting better at making decisions. And what we've been talking about this whole time is that our lives are just a collection of the decisions we made and the consequences of those decisions. And most of us are at a place in our life where we can stand back and look at a few decisions, at least in our life, and say, hey, that wasn't just a momentary kind of decision about what was happening right then. That decision put me on a path to a particular destination. And some of the choices that we make, they wind up that even though I'm loved by God, even though I can be forgiven by God, that there are consequences to those choices, and I wind up putting myself on a path that allows my life to not be blessed by God. That even though I'm loved by God, my life may not be blessed by God. So for the last few weeks, we've been talking to each other about how we can get better at making decisions that put us in a place where we can be both loved by God and have our lives blessed by God. So in the beginning, we started talking about questions that we could ask ourselves and things that we could think about to help us be better at decision making. And right up front, we said, hey, one of the things we need to do is when you're at a point of a decision, if we can just strip away the emotion of it and ask ourselves as honestly as we can, am I being completely honest with myself? Why is it I won't go to marriage counseling? Why is it I want to do that? Why am I doing this really? What's the real reason I don't want to do that? Or what's the real reason I want to do that? And then the next week we started talking about the fact that at points I have to get to and I need to ask myself, am I making this decision out of just protection for myself, or am I doing this with a sense of what's best for everyone involved? And then last week Jason talked to us about a very important one. Am I responding out of what are the characteristics of my life, or what of the situation? Am I just responding out of the situation, or reacting out of the situation? Or am I responding out of what are the base characteristics, the traits, the character traits that are truly the basis of my life? Now today, to sort of wrap up this series, I want to give you one final thing to think about. And I don't want you to really think about it as a final kind of thing, because for many of us, this is more of a thing that we need to be thinking about all along. And the way I want to get at it is I want to talk to you about it like this. One of the things I love, maybe it's because I'm an extrovert, I don't know, but I like to hear people's stories. In fact, one of the things when I meet people around our church that I haven't known before, I'll inevitably ask them, how did you wind up getting here? Are you originally from Coweta County? How did you wind up moving here? I love hearing people's stories. And what I've come to realize, and you know this too, is that people, when they're telling you their story, you wind up condensing great big chunks of your life down to 1 or 2, 3 sentences, just to a paragraph. For instance, think back to when you were in high school, and some of you are still in high school, and when you're in high school in that era, it feels like it's all consuming. It's so much your life. You spend so much time with the same people, and you know everything about everybody else, and you know about relationships, and it's your world, and it's study together and play together and be together, and it's sports and it's activities and it's fun, and you're together, and it's all consuming. But what some of us know as you get a little further away from that, when you talk about high school, you take all of that, all the emotion of it, all the fun of it, all the angst of it, and you boil it down to 1 or 2 sentences. I say, I went to Oklahoma High School. I was in trouble all the time. I wound up doing okay in grades, but I mostly played music. And that's how I condensed 4 years of high school. The same is true of college. You take all the stuff that went on in college, you take all the stuff that went on in your first job, you take all the stuff with your marriage, with your first kid, with your second marriage, your second group of kids. You take all the stuff in these big decision points in your life, and when you wind up telling the story of it, you're going to condense everything that happened around the angst of that, no matter how big it is. It winds up becoming a 1 or 2 or 3 sentences part of the story of your life. Now, the reason I get at that is because where you are right now, the situation you're in right now, we know that at some point in your life, you're going to look back at it, and it's just going to be a story that you tell. No matter how big the decision is, you're going to take whatever the consequences of this are, it's just going to be a part of the overall story of your life. And the good thing is, you get to write that story right now. You get to write the script of it. Now, I'll tell you where this sort of comes from and how it sort of hit me the very first time. No matter how big the decision you are, it's just a story that you're going to tell one day, and you get to write the script of it, and you get to decide what the end of it is going to be, and so you want to make sure you write a really good script. And before you make every decision, you want to make sure you're beginning with that end of what you want to tell, how you want to tell the story in mind. Well, this hit me back in the early 90s, the first time I'd really ever thought about this. When I'm early 30s, I'm barely 30, and I read a book that became for me, over the next 5, 6, maybe more years, the most influential book that I had ever read at the time. It was written by a guy named Stephen Covey, and some of you may have heard of him. He wrote this book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And as I read that book, habit number 2, he said, was you need to begin with the end in mind. And if you read that book, which is still in print and people still circulate it and read it widely, habit number 2, begin with the end in mind, is he actually asks you to go to the very end of your life, go all the way to the end of your life, and to write out what you want to be said about your life. And he actually asks you to write out what you want to be the end of your life story, and then you make decisions in your life with that end in mind. You begin with the end, and then you make decisions in your life to get you to that end. You begin with the end in mind. What's the story that you want your life to tell? So the way it works is, there's a guy, and he says, in 2007, I owned my own business, but the economy really collapsed, and I lost my business, and I was so depressed, and I was so scared, and I didn't know what I was going to do, and it just embarrassed me that I couldn't provide for my family. So I withdrew from my wife and my kids, and I wound up trying to deal with the pain of it by drinking too much, and I eventually developed the point that I drank all the time, and it put such a strain on my marriage, and I never could really find a solid job to provide for my family. And before long, I drank so much that I really couldn't hold a job. And then I lost my family. And that's my story. Or the same situation, the guy could say, in 2007, I owned my own business, and the economy collapsed, and I lost my business. And I was so scared, and I was so afraid, and I was so ashamed that I wasn't going to be able to provide for my family, that I went home and I said to my wife and my kids, we've lost the business. And I'm embarrassed and I'm ashamed that I'm not able to provide for you all the way that I wanted to. But I'm not going to let this beat our family. We're going to lean into each other, and we're going to pray together, and we're going to lean into friends, and we're going to lean into God. We came out of that stronger. Eventually I got another job. Our family is stronger because of the way we grew through that. That's a story that you can tell. See, we don't think about it in the moment. But whatever decision you're in, no matter how big it is, no matter how complicated it is, no matter what it is, whether it's relational, whether it's financial, whether right now your marriage is in a problem, or whether you're having something with a child, no matter what the decision is or how complicated it is and all the swirling emotion around it in your head, eventually it's just going to be a story that you tell. In the decision-making process, the truth is everything I'm deciding right now is one day just going to be a story that I'll tell. And the question that I have to ask myself is, what story is it that I want to tell? What's the end of the story that I'm going to tell about this decision? I was in a relationship, and we were supposed to get married, and then she told me that they didn't love me, and they broke up, and my heart was so broken at the point that when I bumped into somebody else that seemed a little bit interested, I thought to myself, I'll show her that I am worth being loved. I'll show him that somebody does care about me. And I gave myself totally to that relationship. And that relationship wound up taking me into decisions in places that I thought I would never go. And my life totally changed and everything went down. Or I was in a relationship and we were supposed to get married, and then he told me that they didn't love me. And it really hurt me. So I turned to God and I said, God, I'm so hurt and I'm so broken at this point that I'm not just going to run out and get with the first person that'll be with me. Instead, God, I'm not going to date anybody for a year, and I'm going to lean into you, and I'm going to make a decision that I'm going to allow you to heal my life. And I came out of that a whole different, better person. That's a story that you can tell. See, the question is, what story is it you want to tell? What's the story that you want to tell with your life? At every decision point in your life, there's a story that you're going to be telling out of that. Every one of them is just a story to tell. And of course, the dilemma is, for most of us, in those moments of decision makings, we don't think about asking that question, which is these two choices. When I'm faced with these choices, with this myriad of emotions that are swirling around me, which of the choices I'm faced with is most consistent with the story that I want to tell about my life? Because the truth is, The next season of your life, the one that follows this decision that feels so difficult to you, the next part of your life, as big as it is, as scary as it is, the next thing is just going to be this most significant choice you think. All of it is just a story that you're going to tell one day. And here's what I know about you. You want to be able to look in the eyes of the person you love. You want to be able to look into the eyes of your children. You want to be able to look into the eyes of your grandchildren. And you want to be able to tell the whole story without any edits. You want to be able to look into their eyes, and you want to be able to tell a story that you're proud of. None of us want to have to look into the eyes of the people that we care about, and we have to lie about what we did. All of us want to be able to tell the full story in complete sentences with no blinking. We want to tell the full story with no lies. The thing I know about all of you is you want to tell a good story with your life. The way to get there, from the point that you're at to the next place that you're going to be, and this decision that you're in right now, is that you have a chance right now. Even if at this point you've messed up so bad that when you think about your story it's just full of bad decisions, then your story starts today when you say, at that point I realized I'd made so many bad decisions, so I decided then that I'd write a new story. And you write a great story from that point on. You can start a new story today. Well, to get at this and to drive this home as we conclude this series, Hot Mess, so that we don't wind up having to tell a story about the hot mess that we were, I want to read to you a part of the Bible that talks about a guy that was just in a place like this, and he used this principle to help him make the decision. Now, he's a guy named Joseph, and many of you have probably heard his story because he's a guy that even for people who don't read the Bible, his story is so great that even people who aren't Bible people wind up telling his story. In fact, there's a Broadway musical years ago that talked about his Technicolor Dreamcoat. And you can find it in the Bible in the book of Genesis. Now, if you're not a Bible person, let me just catch you up a little bit on the context of this. This is about 1,900 years before Jesus, so this is a long time ago. And it's told about a guy who's born into a big family. He's a son of a man who already had 10 other sons. But when he's born, they lived in a society that believed in, polygamy. So his dad has a bunch of wives, but he only really has one that he really loves. And Joseph is the only son of the wife that he really loved. And the dad, unfortunately, isn't smart enough to not make that clear to everybody. That's why he got the special coat. That's why he got all the special favors. And what that winds up being is that his 10 older brothers, they just hate him. They hate that their dad favors him. They hate that it's pretty apparent that he's going to get the majority of the inheritance, even though that's not what it should be. They get that they're loved, but that he's really loved. So when he's 17, one day when he's 17, they have a discussion about him. And the discussion winds up to two unthinkable choices. Now, I know some of you have just spent the last few days with your family at Thanksgiving, and I know sometimes large family gatherings can be a little bit dysfunctional, and some of you look at your family and you think nobody's more dysfunctional than this, and it was just terrible, and it starts out as this great idea, and then it winds up in chaos. Well, no matter how much you and your siblings or you and your family don't get along, I bet they have never held a discussion like these 10 brothers held about their little brother. They gave themselves only two choices of what they wanted to happen to their little brother. They were either going to kill him or they were going to sell him as a slave. Should we kill him or should we sell him? Are we going to kill him? Everybody for killing him. Everybody for selling him as a slave. And the truth is, the people who wanted to kill him, they had the majority of votes. But the one guy who voted to sell him as a slave, he was a better lobbyist, I guess, and they eventually decided, okay, we're going to sell him as a slave. They sell him into slavery. They take his special coat. They smear some goat blood on it, and they take it back to their dad, and they say, your favorite kid, he's dead. Well, Joseph, he winds up in Egypt, and he winds up in the family of the captain of the whole guard of all of Egypt. He's the head of the army. Now, Joseph has several decisions to make. What do you do when you realize, I'm just a young boy, and I've been sold from being a part of a very large, loving family where my dad dotes on me, and I'm so special to, I'm now a slave, and I'm never seeing my family again. I'll never look into my dad's eyes again. And the great thing about this story is We know so much about it. I mean, it's so applicable to us because we get to see Joseph's story from the beginning of his life to the end of his life. And this is a great story because Joseph, at this first decision point we know about, he decides what to do, what most of us wouldn't have done. He decides, I'm not going to play a victim. I'm not going to talk about the bad side of my story. Instead, I'm going to see this story from the viewpoint of what God is going to do, that I believe God is with me in this. What would God do in my life? So he decides, I'm going to take my responsibility of being a slave as best I can. I'm going to be the best slave that I can be. Well, the guy who's the captain of a guard is the guy named Potiphar. That's his master. And Potiphar sees how dedicated Joseph is, what a great slave he is. And eventually, he just keeps promoting Joseph until Joseph is in charge of everything the man owns. He's in charge of his whole household. There's nobody in the household has more power than Joseph as a slave. He trusts him with absolutely everything. And so here's Joseph. He sees his life as God's up to something. And he's at a place where he's never going to see his family again. It's not perfect. He can't really go wherever he wants to go. But it's not as bad as it could be. And just when it looks like his story is getting a little bit better, he's faced with a decision, and it's the kind of decision where he knows both of these could really wind up being terrible. It could just doom me. And I don't know what I'm going to do. But in the midst of this almost no-win situation, Joseph gives us insights into this idea of, I'm going to tell a great story. I'm going to begin with the end of my story in mind. What story is it I want to write out of this terrible decision? So let me pick this up. I'll read it to you right out of the Bible. It says, so Potiphar, that's the guy again that was Joseph's master, left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. He absolutely trusts Joseph. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome, and you wonder, why do we need to know that? Well, here it is. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. But he refused. Now, we don't know what she looked like, and we don't know how old she was. I mean, people often read that and go, how could he possibly say no? Well, it's a lot we don't know. We don't know what she looked like. We don't know how old she was. We don't know what the whole situation is. What we know is, here's a young man he's lived his life. God's going to be with me even in this terrible situation. I'm going to do as good as I can. My master absolutely trusts me. And now he's in a situation where the master's wife has decided that she wants to be with him. So Joseph knows, hey, if I sleep with her, if I make the decision to do this, I don't know. And so he just refuses. He says no. Now, we know from reading the rest of this in verse 10, we know it's not a one-time thing. She just keeps on coming at him. She just keeps on coming back to this. And at this point, Joseph does what we're talking about because we know he's got to make this decision, and he just keeps on making it. And he thinks to himself, if I sleep with her, well, one day this kind of thing gets found out, and when it's found out, they're going to throw me out. But if I don't sleep with her, well, she could be embarrassed by this whole thing, and then, I'm totally in her charge. She can do with me whatever she wants to do. There is no way, this is not going to turn out good for me. But instead of letting just the emotion of that and the uncontrolled nature of that, and I don't have any good choices, he decides, what's the story I want to tell about this? What's the right story that I want to tell about this? And out loud, what we know is, he tells his story out loud to this woman when she asked him to sleep with him. He sets this decision in the context of his overall story. He says, with me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he entrusted to my care. No one's greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. By the way, you have a story too, ma'am. This decision you're making, this is going to be a part of your permanent story. But apparently she doesn't care about that. She just keeps on. She keeps pushing. And then listen, Joseph has one last question that he says out loud to her, but he's really asking himself. And it's so relevant to those of us who are followers of Christ, because this is right at the point, those of us who said we'd make our life about following Jesus, this is right at the point of where we have to be in decision making. He says, How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? I mean, come on, Mrs. Potiphar. In light of my story of the fact that my brothers hated me, they wanted to kill me, but one of them argued to sell me, and the one who's only won out, God was with me, and he brought me to this house, and I was just a slave, but your husband has trusted me, and now I'm the most powerful person in this house other than your husband. How could I get to the point that I would do this wicked thing and sin against God and against your husband? That's not the story that I want to tell about my life. In light of God's faithfulness to me, that God has been with me, that's not what the story I want to tell about my life. But she keeps after him. I mean, she just stays after him. And as we've seen, he just keeps on refusing because he knows, I've only got one or two stories of this decision I'm going to tell. I need to say, look, God rescued me when my family members abused me, and he put me in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar was a good man, and Potiphar trusted me. And because he trusted me, I had an affair with his wife and blew up his marriage. Well, that's a story he could tell. Or he could say, God was with me, and he rescued me. When my family trashed me, and they sold me into slavery, and they sold me to Potiphar, and Potiphar was a good man, and he trusted me. And when his wife came on to me, I decided to say no, and I would trust God and my master Potiphar. I would place myself in that, even though I knew it could cost me. That's a story. See, every decision that you and I make is just a part of a story that we're going to tell. And as big as it is, as difficult as it is, as much emotion as swirls around it, all of it in just a few years is going to be one or two sentences of a story that you're going to tell in just a few years. It's nothing more than a part of the overall story of your life. Well, Joseph didn't know it, but Joseph was going to get to tell his story a whole bunch of times in the next few years. And it was important that he tell it with integrity. Because Mrs. Potiphar didn't like that he refused her, and so she decided to frame him for rape. And so he gets thrown into prison as a sex criminal, and he's there, and he winds up, while he's there, having to tell his story to a whole bunch of people. And eventually, the head of the warden of the whole guard, he sees this man. He sees the integrity he has, and he winds up promoting him to be in charge of all the prisoners in the whole place. Well, he winds up coming to know a couple of prisoners who used to work for the king of the whole country. And he tells them his story. You know, God's been with me. In spite of the fact that my family trashed me, God was with me and put me in the household of this man Potiphar, who was a good man, who'd firmly trust me. His wife came on to me, and I did nothing wrong. I refused her. I decided to trust God, but she lied, and here I am. I've done nothing wrong. So when you have a chance to go back and get your job back with the king, remember me. See if you can do something for me. Well, eventually he has a chance to serve both of these men. They both have dreams, and God gives Joseph the ability to interpret their dreams. And he tells one of them, you're going to be fully restored to your place with the king. You're going to get your old job back. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happens. He says to the guys he's leaving, hey, don't forget me. Don't forget me. Remember me. Do something good for me. Well, like a lot of people do, the guy forgot Joseph. But 2 years later, when he's in the household of the king, this servant who had been restored, the king has a dream. And the dream so troubles the king that he's asking everybody he knows, does anybody know anybody that can interpret dreams? And this servant who had been with Joseph remembers, oh yeah, when I was in prison, I remember a guy. He interpreted my dream, told me that I'd come back to the household. He can interpret dreams. So they go and get Joseph out of the prison, and he gets to tell his story again in front of the whole king. And the king listens to it, and he interprets the dream for the king. And the king is so impressed with this young man who's had so much integrity, who told his whole story about God being with him, that the king puts him in charge of a crisis that's going on in the nation. And eventually, Joseph gets to be in charge, the second in charge, just below the king of the whole country. And eventually, when a great famine comes over the whole country, Joseph is in charge of leading the people of Egypt through the famine. And eventually he takes over the whole region, and Joseph's 10 brothers have to come to him to ask for food. They don't recognize him. He just looks like an Egyptian in power to them. But they have to come to him and ask for food. And all because Joseph decided, I'm going to tell a story that God is with me, and God will be with me. And I'm going to tell a story with a great end in mind. Now, another part of this that we don't talk a lot about in life is that Joseph's brothers, they had a story that they were going to tell. They had a story about this event that they had to tell as well. Their story was, we had a little brother, and our dad loved him, but we hated him. And eventually we decided to have a conversation about it, and we voted to kill him, but one of our brothers lobbied that we sell him. And so we sold him into slavery, and we told our dad that he was dead. And our dad, it broke his heart. And every year on Joseph's birthday, we watched our dad cry, and we had to lie about what happened to him. And that day when we sold him into slavery, that's the day that we became lifetime liars. Some of you know what that's like. To make a decision that turns you into a liar for a lifetime. Some of you are at a point right now where you're making a decision about your marriage, about your company, about your job, and you know that in the future you're going to have to lie about it. The profit looks good, the opportunity looks good, the way you're handling it feels right because you're going to get back at somebody in the relationship, but you know, even if it goes exactly the way you want, there's a part of it you're not proud of it, and you're going to have to lie. For life, you're going to have to lie. Here's what I'd say to you. Don't make a decision in the moment that when you get to tell your story, you look back and in your heart you know, that was the moment I became a liar for life. I moved from telling lies to I had to lie about my life for the rest of my life. Don't do something. I don't care how good it looks to you. You have to get to the point that these brothers do. We had a brother. Our dad loved him, but we hated him. We decided to sell him and tell our dad that he was dead. And for the rest of our lives, we had to lie about that to our dad. But of course, some of you know that wasn't the end of the story. Some of you know already how it ends up. See, the famine forces, as I already said, Joseph's brothers to come to Egypt. And when they get there, they just see this powerful Egyptian. They don't know it's Joseph, but Joseph knows it's them. And Joseph is faced with the decision that I bet only in his dreams he ever thought would come true. I mean, they don't recognize him, but he knows it's them. And now he has this decision that only happens in those revenge dreams that you have in your life. What do I do? What would I do if my hateful, lying brothers come to me and I have power over them? Do I use my power to get back at them? Do I use it to get revenge? Do I put them in their place? Do I do to them exactly what they have deserved to have done to them all the time I spent in prison unfairly, all the time I served as a slave? How do I use the power that God has brought me to? How do I use that power? What do I do? Or do I do for them exactly what God has done for me? Which of these options is consistent with the story that I want to tell? Which of the ones is the story that I want told about my life? Option number one, story number one, my brothers sold me into slavery. And eventually God brought them to the point that they had to come and ask me for food, and they didn't recognize me, but I recognized them. And I revealed myself to them, and on the spot I said, you thought you sold me into slavery? Die like dogs. And I killed them all. Well, that's a story. Or story number two is, my brothers hated me and they sold me into slavery, but God was with me. And God one day brought them to have to come and beg for food for them and their families. And they didn't recognize me, but I recognized them. And in the moment, I revealed to them who I was. And in that moment, I did for them what God had done for me, and I gave them exactly what they did not deserve. I fed them and their families, and I brought them in. I forgave them, and we were restored. That's a story. And that's a story with a man who was consistent with, God is with me, and God is up to something. Let's see what God's going to do. Either decision is just a story that you're going to tell in a few years, in 3 or 4 sentences. See how it works? So let me talk to you right now about next steps. And here we are at the end of this series, and would you go ahead and get a connection card, and would you put your name on it in a way that we can contact you? And I know if this is one of your first times here, it seems odd that we ask you to do this, but really we use these as a way that we can pray for you. We'd love to be able to pray for you by name. And if it's your first time, we just want to thank you for coming. We're not going to come and bother your home. we just want to thank you for being a part of what's gone on today. And on the back of this is this part that says something about my next step is. We believe that everybody has a next step to take on what we've talked about today. See, here's what I know. At every critical decision point in your life, and some of you, you are at critical decision points right now. In your marriage, in your career, in your relationships, and what's happening to you morally, and decisions that you're making, you're at critical decision points. What story do you want told about your life? What's the end that you want to tell? If you begin with the end in mind, then you look back and you begin to make this decision in light of the story you want told about your life. You write a good story, making a decision. I make every decision in light of what's the story I want to tell. What's the most God-honoring story my life can tell? Parents, I'll tell you something that we rarely think about. It's how your story connects with your kid's story. Do you know where your kid's story starts? It starts with you. With your life, with your stories, with what you did, with how you lived. And your life either becomes an inspiration, it becomes a springboard, and they start with my dad, my mom, they were like this, and they gave me such a boost in life. Or your story becomes a story that they decide to live in spite of. But they always have to start with your story. Your story is a part of their story. If you're single, right now you're alone, your story while you're single will one day become a part of a story that if you're ever together with somebody, if you're ever married, your story now will be a part of their story one day. And here's what I know. You want to be able to look at your mate in the future. You want to be able to look them in the eye, and you want to be able to tell the whole story with no editing, with no lying. You want to be able to be completely honest with them, to tell them the whole story. But you get the choice to write that story, write it well now so you can, what's the end of your single story that you want to tell? Right now you're writing a story. You're a freshman in college, somebody's trying to invest in you and they're trying to help you, but you blow it off because you're only 18 years old. One day, this will just be a story that you tell. If you're starting your first job, it's just going to be a story you tell. If you're right at the beginning of working, your parenting, this is just a story that you're going to tell one day. So would you consider beginning with the end in mind and ask yourself at the decision points, what's the story that I want to tell about my life as a parent? What's the story I want to tell about my life as a single person? What's the end? What's the most God-honoring story I want told about my life? Because what I know is, we all want to be able to look in the eyes of the people we love. You want to be able to look into your grandkids' eyes and your kids' eyes. You want to be able to tell them the whole story without having to lie about any part, without being afraid of any question. For those of us who followed God, we one day want to be able to look into our Father's eyes and be proud of the most God-honoring story that we could write with our life. If you're at a point where you've made so many bad decisions and your life is really a hot mess, then your story, your new story could start today. As you make a decision that today, I'm going to write a new story, a God-honoring story. I'm going to decide to follow Jesus from this point on with my life. To keep your life from winding up as one big hot mess, here's what you have to do at every single decision point. We weigh our decisions in light of, what's the story I want to tell? And you get to decide in this moment, with this decision, no matter how complicated it is, and one day will just be a 2-sentence part of your story. You get to decide what you're going to do. You don't get to decide what happens. But then you get to decide how you respond to what happens, and that just becomes a next part in the story that you tell. So tell a good one. Write a good story. Tell a good, God-honoring story that you can be proud of with your life. You can do it if you begin with the end in mind and you make your decisions with that in mind. Let me pray for you. Father in heaven, I thank you that from the beginning of time, as you write the story of this world, you had us in mind. That your thought as you created us was that one day we'd be back together, that you wanted to be with us and So you sent Jesus to be with us, that we are part of the end of your story. God, would you help us to write a story that honors you with the decisions of our life and even decisions that we made? Would you help us to make a decision today to write a better story, making good, God-honoring decisions today? Thank you for your love for us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.